What if the person you loved most was hiding the truth that could destroy you? She gave her trust without hesitation, believing in a future built on love and loyalty. But behind every promise was a lie waiting to surface, and behind every smile, a secret ready to break her world apart. When the truth finally comes out, it doesn't just hurt, it changes everything. The life she knew disappears in an instant. But in that darkness, she finds something stronger than pain, her own power. Because this time she won't fall. She'll rise, reclaiming her life and proving that betrayal can never define her. The lesson? Sometimes the people closest to you teach you the hardest lessons. Trust your instincts, protect your worth, and remember, losing the wrong person is how you make space for the right life. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to like, share, and support the channel. Your support is the biggest motivation for us to continue creating more powerful stories like this. Thanks for watching.
She was in labor, alone, breathing through another contraction in a sterile private room at a Boston hospital. She checked the timer on her smartwatch while her husband, Julian, insisted over the phone he was trapped in a client emergency across the city. He wasn't in an emergency. He was mixing a cocktail in a penthouse apartment, presenting it to another woman, a real estate developer whose sudden, debilitating migraine apparently demanded a five-star hotel experience, and the undivided attention of a man who had stopped responding to his pregnant wife's texts an hour ago. And when he finally answered her call, he saw her name on the screen, looked at the woman on the couch, and sent the call to voicemail. Instead of offering a shred of compassion, he texted 5 words that would ignite a firestorm. "Chloe needs me right now." He prioritized his associate's fake ailment over his wife's labor, leaving her to face childbirth alone while he catered to his mistress. All the while, nurses moved with quiet efficiency outside her door, and his own mother, Beatrice, FaceTimed him, catching a glimpse of the other woman and remarking how devoted he was to his work. But none of them understood the truth. Not the architect husband, not the ambitious mistress, not the dismissive mother-in-law. The woman they had just written off, the woman timing her breaths in that quiet room, saying nothing. She was the anonymous founder of the software firm that had bankrolled his entire career. She was a silent shadow billionaire, and she was about to make one quiet call to her security chief that would liquidate the very foundations of their life, the company, the penthouse, and the illusion of power he thought he had built. What she did next left him so financially and professionally ruined, he was speechless. And the subsequent investigation into his mistress uncovered a conspiracy of fraud that dismantled every lie he'd ever told. This story reveals a critical truth. Never interpret composure as weakness. Never mistake privacy for a lack of power, and never use someone's moment of need as your moment of convenience. You have no idea who you're dealing with, and by the time you learn, it will be the most costly lesson of your entire life. If that message connects with you, type the word power in the comments right now. Hit the like button so this story finds someone who needs to hear it. Share it with anyone who has ever been made to feel small, and subscribe to this channel so you never miss a reminder of your own strength. Stay with us to the very end because the most defining moment is waiting there. To anyone who has ever been dismissed, betrayed, or made to feel invisible by someone you trusted, this story is for you. Today, you'll see why the most unassuming person in the room is often the one holding all the cards, why deceit has a way of boomeranging back to the sender, and why maintaining your dignity in silence is the ultimate answer to betrayal. Watch every detail because each turn holds a vital lesson. Let us know in the comments what you learned and what your move would have been. Subscribe for more stories that empower you. No one at the prestigious St. Augustine's Boston Medical Center knew, not the head of oncology, not the director of finance, not the valet team at the front entrance, that the woman in room 312, quietly breathing through her contractions, was the anonymous benefactor who had funded their entire new advanced technology wing. She was a ghost in the system, a name on a legal document, and she was completely oblivious. of how her closely guarded privacy was about to become the most lethal tool she possessed, not through some grand design, but because fate has a cruelly perfect sense of irony. Her firm had acquired the hospital's parent real estate company as part of a portfolio diversification just over 400 days ago. She'd never set foot inside, never met the board, and had no clue this would be the place her baby would decide to enter the world. She also had no clue it was the same hospital, where her husband of 5 years, the man she had built an empire to support, would bring his mistress for a fabricated migraine on the exact same night. His associate had a migraine, and he brought her to the most exclusive medical facility in Boston. The same city, the same building, the same day. It was as if every detail of this disaster had been meticulously planned by a merciless playwright. What happens when the most powerful woman in the city has been quietly overlooked the entire time? What did she do that left him completely broken? When the reality of her identity finally crashed down on him, was there anything left for him to salvage? Viewers, what you've heard so far is just the setup, the true story, the betrayal that was planned for months, the secret that extends far beyond one hospital, and the final act that shatters the man who believed he was invincible is still to come. This story will do more than entertain you. It will show you what true resilience looks like when it's been stretched to its breaking point. Stay until the last word, because that is where the most valuable lesson is revealed. Post in the comments what you're feeling right now and subscribe for more unforgettable stories just like this one. The contractions were now every 4 minutes, but Ela Vance had stopped tracking them with fear and started logging them with the calm, data-driven focus of a woman who learned long ago that panic was an inefficient use of energy. She sat in a room at St. Augustine's Boston Medical Center, the city's premier medical institution, a tower of glass and steel with quiet corridors and the kind of seamless service that massive private funding buys. She leaned her head against the cool pillow with the deliberate stillness of someone trying to manage their pain privately. Her overnight bag was on the chair. She'd packed it herself a month ago, folding every tiny piece of clothing with the hopeful joy of a woman who had fought for years for this baby. A small gray sleeper with tiny stars on the feet, a worn paperback from her father, and a framed photo of her first server rack, the machine in a garage that had started it all. Her first investor had looked at her across a cluttered desk years ago and said, "Everything you create will come from your mind. That is the asset." Ela hadn't fully grasped the scale of that sentiment until the valuation numbers came in a few years later. But tonight, she wasn't thinking about valuations or shell corporations or the staggering wealth tied to her identity. She was thinking about the fact that her husband, Julian, hadn't answered her last 2 calls. She was thinking about the way the admitting nurse had been perfectly polite but entirely impersonal. She was thinking about how the silence in the room felt heavy and how, more than anything, she just wanted his hand to hold. It wasn't there. She had first called Julian at 7:15 in the evening. The contractions were still mild then, and she had managed to keep her voice even and calm. He answered on the 3rd ring, his voice having that slick, distracted quality she had come to associate with his big meetings, the sound of a man performing for an audience that wasn't her. "I'm on my way," he'd said. "This client is just relentless. Get settled in. I'll be there as soon as I can break away." She had trusted him because for 5 years she had chosen to, and because the other possibility, the suspicion that had been growing like a poison vine for the last year, was a truth she wasn't prepared to confront while bringing their child into the world. Here is a piece of advice, viewers. A person's true character is revealed by how they treat you when you have nothing they need. Remember that. It will protect you. But Julian was not stuck with a client. At the exact moment, Clara was being checked into the standard maternity ward on the 7th floor when Julian Thorne guided his black sedan to a halt at the emergency entrance of Lakeside General Hospital. He stepped out with the practiced ease of a man who commanded every space he occupied, rounding the car to open the passenger door for a woman named Chloe Sterling. Chloe had a sprained ankle. She pressed a hand to her forehead dramatically as she emerged, her designer jeans immaculate, her boots making sharp, impatient sounds against the pavement. Every move was a performance of fragility, and Julian was her captive audience. He steered her through the automatic doors with a hand at the small of her back, his expression etched with more concern than Clara had seen from him in 9 months of pregnancy. At the admissions desk, the nurse was processing Chloe's information for a private examination room when Julian placed his platinum card on the counter without a second thought. It was the same desk where an hour earlier, Clara had stood alone. He had not booked a suite for the mother of his child. He had, Isla would soon realize, reserved one for his mistress weeks ago. The standard room on the 3rd floor was quiet, with a large window overlooking the city lights. The nurse had called it the best room on the floor with a comforting smile. Isla had just settled in, trying to find a comfortable position. She was adjusting the light hospital blanket over her swollen legs, phone in hand, about to call Marcus again, when the privacy curtain rustled. He was finally here, but he wasn't by himself. A contraction seized Chloe right then, a tidal wave of pressure that bleached all thought from her mind, leaving only a pinpoint of intense, physical reality. When the wave receded and her vision swam back into focus, she saw her husband, Marcus, standing in the doorway of her room with his mistress, Isabella, clinging to his arm. His mother, Genevieve, rose from a chair in the corner. She had been so still, Chloe hadn't even noticed she was there. Genevieve smoothed the lapels of her cashmere coat, her face a mask of indifference. The glance that passed between her and her son was a complete conversation, conducted in less than 2 seconds. Marcus crossed to Chloe's bedside. He didn't ask how she felt. There was no flicker of guilt, no apology, not even the basic human decency the moment demanded. He looked at her the way a developer looks at an old building slated for demolition, an object to be dealt with quickly and without emotion. His voice was a low murmur, meant only for Chloe and his mother. Isabella has a blinding migraine. She needs to lie down. You can have the chair. Chloe just stared at him, speechless. Another contraction was already gathering deep in her back, a distant thunder 30 seconds out but approaching fast. In the brief calm before that storm broke, she looked at the man she had married, the father of the child she was hours from giving birth to, and she knew with a sudden chilling clarity that she had been a fool about him for a very, very long time. She didn't react quickly enough for his liking. Marcus reached over her, grabbed the side of the hospital bed, and with a single decisive shove, repositioned it. He angled it away from her, toward Isabella, clearing the path. The message was brutally public and unmistakable. He had just ejected his wife, in the middle of labor, from her hospital bed to accommodate his mistress's headache. At the nurse's station not 5 feet away, a woman had gone perfectly rigid. Her name was Sarah Jenkins. At 35 years old, with 12 years of obstetric nursing under her belt, Sarah stood behind the counter and watched the scene unfold with the frozen stillness of someone witnessing a car crash in slow motion. She understood she was powerless to intervene. She lifted her coffee mug to her lips and took a long, measured sip, the only act of defiance available to her. Across the ward, another patient lowered her magazine, her eyes wide. The fluorescent lights overhead suddenly seemed harsher, more unforgiving, as if the room itself were determined to burn every detail of this humiliation into memory. And Genevieve, watching her daughter-in-law clutch the window frame as the contraction peaked, watching her double over with an involuntary gasp that no woman should ever have to utter alone, covered her mouth. not with a hand of shock, but to stifle a laugh. It was a tiny, controlled sound, a sliver of cruelty far sharper than any shout because it was wrapped in amusement. The sound struck Chloe with the force of a physical blow. When people show you their true colors in a moment of crisis, my friends, when they find humor in your agony or treat your deepest vulnerability as a mere inconvenience, you must believe them. Not the second time, not the third, the very first time. For 4 years, Genevieve had broadcasted her disdain for Chloe through 1,000 tiny cuts, the kind of polished, deniable cruelty that wealthy women hone into an art form. The dinner party where she'd eyed the painting Chloe had proudly hung, remarking with a paper-thin smile, "How charming." Marcus always did have a soft spot for the obscure. The family photos on the grand piano in their Lincoln Park home, constantly rearranged so Chloe was always on the periphery, slightly out of focus, as if she'd stumbled into the shot by mistake. The way Genevieve would gush about Isabella Reyes at charity functions long before Chloe knew she was more than a name, a truly captivating woman. She just gets what a man of Marcus's caliber requires. It was the unmistakable enthusiasm of a mother who had already handpicked her son's next wife and was merely waiting for the current one to get the hint. Chloe had never fought back against any of it, not from weakness, but from a core principle passed down from her grandmother, along with the family trust. The greatest power you have over someone who underestimates you is to let them keep doing it, right up until the precise moment it no longer serves you. 4 seconds after Genevieve laughed, Chloe decided that moment had just arrived. Chloe straightened up as the contraction subsided. She let go of the window frame, turned, and met Genevieve's gaze. Her eyes, which moments before had been clouded with pain, were now perfectly, frighteningly clear. She reached into her overnight bag, pulled out her phone, and scrolled to a contact marked not with a name, but with a single icon, a golden lion. She hit dial. The phone rang twice, only twice, before a man answered. His voice wasn't that of a secretary or an assistant. It was the voice of someone who never had to be told anything more than once. The man's name was Arthur Vance. He was 63 years old, and for 22 of those years, he had been the sole steward of the Ashworth family fortune, managing its vast architecture with the silent precision of a master watchmaker. Chloe spoke only 4 words. "Arthur, I'm at Lakeshore." There was a brief silence on the line, not of confusion, but of a powerful mind instantly recalibrating a complex equation with an unexpected new variable. Then Arthur replied in the calm, steady tone of a man who had been preparing for this exact contingency for 2 decades. "I understand. I'll be there in 10 minutes. In the back of a town car speeding down Lakeshore Drive, Arthur's nephew, Leo, a junior associate just 6 months into his tenure, looked up from his tablet. Arthur had already disconnected the call and was putting on his overcoat. "Change of destination," Arthur said. "We're going to Lakeshore General." Leo frowned. "Sir, it's almost 11 at night. What's at Lakeshore?" Arthur adjusted his cuffs, opened the car door, and said one word: "The reset." Chloe ended the call and put the phone back in her bag. She lowered herself into the visitor's chair, the one her husband had banished her to so his lover could have her bed. She folded her hands in her lap, possessing the unnerving stillness of someone who has just lit a very long fuse and is now simply waiting for the explosion. Marcus didn't even notice. He was busy fluffing a pillow behind Isabella's head, whispering to her, his hand resting on the bedrail with an air of ownership. It was as if he had either completely forgotten or simply ceased to care that his wife was 4 feet away, actively giving birth to his child. Genevieve had returned to her corner chair. She had taken a small gold compact from her purse and was meticulously reapplying her lipstick, her focus absolute, as if she were preparing for a night at the opera, not attending a birth. Her eyes met Chloe's in the tiny mirror for a fraction of a second, and the expression she offered wasn't just malice. It was something colder. It was dismissal. 10 minutes. Chloe breathed through the next contraction alone, one hand pressed against the cool glass of the window, her gaze fixed on the sprawling city lights below. She waited. The change in the hospital's atmosphere started at exactly 9 minutes and 50 seconds after her call. It began subtly, the way the air pressure drops before a storm. It was the sound of people accustomed to being in charge moving through a space, causing everyone else to instinctively shift around a new center of gravity. Chloe heard it before she saw anything. The sharp, purposeful rhythm of expensive shoes on linoleum, a low and rapid exchange of voices that sounded like commands, not questions. The distinct sound of a door swinging open with an authority hospital doors rarely possess. Then Arthur Vance walked into the room. He was flanked by two others, a woman in a severe dark gray suit holding a leather satchel, and a man in a navy blazer whose hospital ID badge was a deep crimson, unlike any other Chloe had seen that night. It was the kind of badge that made doors unlock themselves. Arthur was 63 and looked it, with his silver hair and quiet academic glasses, the sort of man who inspired immediate confidence. But he moved through that ward with the unshakable certainty of a man who had just decided to remind everyone that his client, in fact, owned the entire building. He crossed the room in 12 steps and stopped directly in front of Chloe. He took in the scene, Chloe in the chair, the hospital bed, 4 feet from her, occupied by another woman feigning discomfort. The man standing beside that bed, who was now turning around, his face a picture of stunned confusion at the intrusion. Arthur's expression, in the space of a single heartbeat, conveyed everything that needed to be said before a single word was spoken. He then turned his attention to the nurse, Sarah, the same one who had stood frozen at her station, and he said, his voice perfectly level and utterly final, "Please have the Founders Lounge on the penthouse level prepared for Mrs. Sterling at once, with the full medical response team. Dr. Evelyn Reed is leading them. She's already on her way." The gallery assistant, Sarah, didn't even blink. She didn't ask why. She didn't glance at Liam for a nod of approval. She just gave a single sharp nod and left the main hall, moving with a speed that was just shy of a full-blown sprint. Liam had turned completely around now, his hand falling from the velvet rope. His face cycled through a series of expressions, first confusion, then annoyance. And then came the specific type of outrage a man feels when his command is usurped in a space he considers his own. He finally landed on the version of himself that always worked, the one he used in tense acquisitions and at family holidays to put everyone back in their place. He straightened his tuxedo. "Excuse me," he said, aiming the words at Marcus like darts. His tone was clipped, precise, and carried the expectation of immediate compliance. "Who in the world are you, and what gives you the right to issue orders to the staff at my own gallery opening?" Marcus looked at Liam Sterling with the weary, almost pained expression of a man watching another person stride confidently toward the edge of a canyon they haven't yet noticed. "My name is Marcus Vance," he said calmly. "I am the chief executive of the Ashford Sterling family office, which, as of 18 months ago, assumed full ownership and controlling interest in the Sterling Gallery and its entire acquisitions portfolio." He let the words hang in the air. "Miss Chloe Sterling," he added, "is the fund's sole beneficiary and principal." The buzzing gallery fell into a stunned silence. Leo Vance, standing near the entrance holding his father's briefcase, watched the scene play out with his jaw slightly agape. He glanced over at Sarah, the assistant, who had paused by the bar on her way out. She picked up a glass of water, took a long, slow sip, the kind of sip a person takes when they've just seen the most deeply satisfying karmic takedown of their professional life and wanted to savor every last drop. Liam's polished facade didn't shatter right away. It held for a moment, a strange, slow motion crumbling. It was like a building whose supports have been dynamited, but whose exterior remains intact for a few seconds from sheer habit, defying physics just before the inevitable collapse. Isabella had snapped her jeweled clutch shut. Ava had ceased her performance of the overwhelmed artist, and Chloe, from her seat in a quiet alcove, looked at her husband for a long, unwavering moment. She looked at the man who had dismissed her to a back room, who had put another woman on a pedestal in her own gallery, who had been married to her for 5 years, and never once bothered to see the person who existed behind his assumptions. And then she spoke, her voice quiet but clear. "Marcus, please have Miss Monroe's pieces removed from the premises before morning." She was featured for her vision. She rose, smoothing the front of her silk maternity gown, and picked up her small overnight bag. "Liam," she said as she started toward the exit, with Marcus and his team creating a subtle barrier around her, "your mother just described my life's work as a charming little hobby." She didn't say it with anger, but with the flat finality of someone entering a fact into a permanent record for all to hear.
"Remember she said that," she added, "because I will." And with that, she walked out of the gala, out from the shadows, out from the alcove, and out of the diminished version of herself that had been quietly accepting a seat that was far beneath her for 5 long years. She never once looked back. The private elevator doors slid open onto the penthouse level, and Chloe stepped into a space so radically different from the crowded gallery she had just left that it felt like crossing into another dimension, separated not just by floors, but by the vast, breathtaking distance
between who she had been forced to be and who she truly was. The Founders Lounge of the Sterling Gallery had been designed by the same firm that curated the private residences of 3 European royal families. The floors were dark, reclaimed mahogany, the lighting was soft and recessed, and the air held the faint, clean scent of cedar from a climate control system that cost more to install than most people make in a lifetime. On a console table, there were fresh orchids. A cascade of white blossoms in a minimalist vase replaced every 48 hours, whether anyone was there to appreciate them or not. Chloe had been paying for those flowers without even knowing they were here. Dr. Evelyn Reed was already waiting by the door. She was 57, the most sought-after private physician in Chicago, a woman who had built an empire over 30 years by delivering the children of the city's elite with a focused, calm brilliance that immense wealth could grant access to, but could never create on its own. She had gotten Marcus's text 9 minutes ago. She was already in the building, attending the gala as a guest, and had made her way up with the quiet urgency of a woman who knew that some calls required her immediate presence, no questions asked. She took one look at Chloe, at the exhaustion in her eyes, the careful way she held her body, the overnight bag slung over her shoulder as a sad testament to how utterly she'd been left to fend for herself, and she said nothing about the drama downstairs. She just rested a hand gently on Chloe's arm and said, "You are in the right place now. From this moment on, everything is handled." It was 13 words, but they were the first 13 words spoken to Chloe all night that were aimed solely at her own well-being, with no hidden motive, no performance, and none of the crushing weight of someone else's ego attached. Chloe felt them settle somewhere deep inside her, a place that had been hollowed out. She nodded once and let the doctor guide her in. The lounge was magnificent, a sprawling private suite with a single sweeping window that offered a panorama of the Chicago skyline. The medical equipment was so seamlessly integrated into the decor that it was nearly invisible, the quiet, powerful machinery of world-class care hidden within bespoke cabinetry. There was a bassinet, a proper one lined with soft linen, waiting beside a plush armchair, not a plastic guest chair, not an afterthought, but a chair placed with the clear intention that a mother would want to sit there, that she would want to be beside her child after they arrived. Chloe put her bag on a small table. She pulled out a tiny hand-knitted blue cap. She placed it where she could see it. Then she took out a framed photo of her grandmother, Catherine Ashford, the woman who had quietly built an industrial empire, who lived modestly despite her staggering fortune, who had told Chloe once, leaning over a vast oak desk with the unique seriousness of a woman who knew she was running out of time to say what was important. "The money is the least of it, my dear. What I'm really leaving you is the knowledge that a woman who is consistently underestimated is wielding a weapon no one can take from you because no one ever thinks to look for it." Chloe hadn't fully grasped it back then. She understood it now. She understood it with the blinding clarity that only comes when you live through the very scenario a piece of wisdom was meant to prepare you for. 3 floors down, the main gallery had become the stage for a much different kind of show. Liam Sterling hadn't moved for a full minute after Chloe left. He just stood there in the middle of his gala, beside the very platform he had built for his mistress, in front of the bar where Sarah, the assistant, was now very deliberately polishing glasses, refusing to look his way. The brilliant lighting that had made the art pop now seemed harsh and exposing. His wife owned the gallery, not as a silent partner, not as a minor shareholder. She owned all of it. The building he was in, the floor he stood on, the multi-million-dollar collection he had leveraged to build his entire career. All of it was Chloe's. It had been Chloe's for 18 months, all while he conducted his affair with the smug confidence of a man who believed his wife was too gentle, too unassuming, and too dependent on him to ever challenge his world. The truth didn't dawn on him. It hit him like a wrecking ball. It was a complete and total structural failure, a series of small, ignored cracks suddenly giving way to a catastrophic collapse, revealing the truth of what and who had been holding his entire world together. He turned to Isabella. His mother was sitting perfectly still. Her clutch was back in her lap, her lipstick was flawless, but her face, the one that had watched Chloe's discomfort with a detached amusement, the one that had spent years subtly pushing Chloe to the margins of family photos, had transformed into something Liam had never seen in his 51 years. Isabella Sterling, a woman who had never been in a room where she wasn't the most powerful person, looked, for the very first time in her life, like someone who had just made a fatal and irreversible mistake. "Did you know?" Liam asked. It wasn't an accusation filled with rage. It was a hollow, weightless question from a man surveying the ruins of a life he thought he had built. Isabella said nothing at all. Ava, who had been standing awkwardly on her platform as her audience and relevance evaporated, finally swung her legs over the side and grabbed her jacket. Her artistic sensitivity had, it seemed, vanished. "I should probably go," she announced to no one in particular. "Yes," Sarah replied from the bar, still not looking up from her task. "You probably should." Now, up on the 32nd floor, in the penthouse suite of the Vance wing, Clara breathed through another wave of pressure with Arthur, her family's advisor, by her side. She wasn't in a crowded ward, not in a plastic chair, not alone. As the contraction eased, she gazed out at the Chicago skyline, a landscape her mother had helped build. She thought of that woman's quiet strength, the kind of power that never needed to be announced because it was visible in the steel and glass all around them. Arthur knocked gently before re-entering the room. He held an iPad, the screen displaying a single document inside a secure digital folder, the kind of file that, once authorized, set irreversible events into motion. He placed it on the table next to her overnight bag. "The board is standing by for your directive," Arthur said, his voice low. "Whenever you're ready." Clara looked at the screen. It was the charter for a new initiative she'd conceived herself, the reallocation of a substantial portion of the Vance Foundation's annual budget toward public maternal wellness centers. These centers would specifically serve the city's underfunded communities, helping women who were forced to wait in chaotic emergency rooms because they had no other choice. This wasn't a decision made from spite, it was one made from sudden, sharp-edged clarity, the kind you can only have after you've glimpsed the very reality you want to spare someone else from. She signed it, her full name, Clara Vance, with the steady hand of a woman who wasn't tearing something down, but building something new. When you leave a partnership that was slowly erasing you, dear viewers, or a job that felt toxic, or a friendship that only drained you, the hardest moment is not walking away. It's resisting the pull to go back when the person who broke your trust suddenly claims they can't live without you. Guard your peace. It's the most precious asset you will ever have. For a few minutes, the room was calm. Everything felt right. Clara was secure. Her child was on the way. The insult of the 7th floor a distant memory. But 40 minutes into that quiet, Arthur's phone buzzed with a message that shattered the peace like a fist through a window. Beatrice Thorne had not been waiting idly while her son Julian was playing the hero in the emergency room. Beatrice had made a phone call, not to a relative, but to Marcus Cole, the Thorne family's notoriously aggressive corporate lawyer. Cole was a shark who had been on retainer for 2 decades and understood instinctively that the perfect time to strike is the moment your opponent thinks the battle is won. Less than an hour after Clara had been moved to the penthouse, Cole had arrived at the courthouse with an emergency filing. It was a motion to establish immediate paternal financial oversight, claiming Clara was, and these were his words, emotionally erratic and making impulsive, financially reckless decisions. He argued for a court-appointed trustee to manage the newborn's estate from the moment of birth. The motion included a signed affidavit from Beatrice, alleging Clara was attempting to divert marital assets into personal vanity projects, proving she was an untrustworthy fiduciary for her own child. Arthur relayed the news to Clara between contractions. She was mid-breath, mid-focus, in the middle of the most profound physical experience of her life, when she was told a legal team was trying to challenge her financial and maternal authority. The peace was broken. The sense of victory evaporated. Narcissists don't just accept a loss, dear viewers, they escalate. The moment you stand up for yourself, you must expect them and their enablers to come after you with everything they've got. Prepare for it. Have your own team ready. Document it all. But Arthur hadn't managed the Vance family's affairs for 30 years by being caught off guard. He had spent 3 decades anticipating every conceivable line of attack and erecting defenses that remained invisible until the moment they were activated. Within 90 minutes, Arthur had completely dismantled Cole's motion. He produced the ironclad prenuptial agreement confirming that all Vance Foundation assets were Clara's alone, legally firewalled from the marriage. The claim of recklessness was irrelevant. Furthermore, Arthur filed a counter-motion with evidence of Julian's financial indiscretions with a junior analyst at his firm. The evidence included the lease for a luxury apartment co-signed in Chloe's name, credit card statements, and time-stamped security footage from the hospital lobby showing Julian fussing over his mistress while his wife, visibly in labor, was left waiting. The emergency judge dismissed Cole's motion less than 90 minutes after it was filed. It wasn't even a contest. Arthur's assistant, a young associate named Ben, who had been ferrying documents across the city, arrived on the 32nd floor out of breath, his tie askew. He looked less like a lawyer and more like someone who had just run a marathon. He placed the final signed order on Arthur's desk, let out a huge breath, and asked, "Is it always this intense?" Arthur, without glancing up, replied, "This is a quiet night." Clara Vance's son was born at 11:52 in the evening. He entered the world on the 32nd floor of a building that bore his mother's name, delivered by the most respected obstetrician in Chicago. in a suite filled with the kind of focused, unconditional care that gives everything and asks for nothing. He arrived without an audience, without the hollow performance of people who hadn't earned a ticket to the show. When the doctor laid the baby in Clara's arms, still wrapped in the warmth of his first moments on earth, she looked down at his face and felt something she hadn't felt in years. Whole. Not the fragile wholeness that comes from arranging your life around another person, but the solid, structural wholeness of someone who has found her way back home to herself. She held her son to her chest, feeling his weight, the perfect and irreplaceable weight of this child in this moment, and she made him a promise. She didn't say it out loud because it didn't need to be said, it only needed to be true. You will never be made to feel like you come second, not once, not ever, not as long as I am here. Arthur returned to the suite after midnight with a cup of chamomile tea he had procured from the private kitchen. He also came with the news that the Foundation's legal team had already begun executing the new charter initiative Clara had signed. Clara was nursing her son when he came in. She glanced up. Arthur set the tea on the table with the silent efficiency of a man who has spent a lifetime anticipating needs before they are ever spoken. "He's in the lobby," Arthur said softly. "He has been down there for a while." Clara looked at her son, at his tiny, perfect face, at the little bear stitched onto his sleeper. "Arthur," she said, "what did my mother do when a man told her that her vision for a building was impossible?" Arthur was quiet for a moment. He had worked alongside Margaret Vance for over 20 years before she passed. The answer wasn't complicated, but it was powerful, and it was the kind of truth that needed no adornment. "She didn't argue with him, Clara," he said. "She just built it. She let the finished skyscraper be the only reply he ever needed." Clara nodded slowly. "Tell him he can come up." But tell him he comes alone. Not his mother, not anyone else. Just him. Julian Thorne stepped out of the private elevator onto the 32nd floor at 12:21 in the morning, and the first thing he felt was the shift in power. The cool marble, the original art, the clean scent of ozone in the air. It was a rebuke, an argument made not with words, but with architecture. Clara was sitting in a wide armchair by the window as he entered, their son asleep on her chest. The entire Chicago skyline was spread out behind her, a glittering backdrop that spoke of scale and legacy. She did not look at him right away. She finished what she was doing, carefully adjusting the soft fabric of the baby's sleeper with the deliberate tenderness of someone for whom that small task was the only thing in the world that mattered. And then she looked up at him. Julian Thorne had walked into countless rooms in his life expecting to own them, but in this one, he knew he didn't even belong. To control the narrative, to frame it around his own logic. But standing in the doorway of their Chicago apartment, watching his wife by the window with a suitcase at her feet, he had no framework, no logic could be applied, no control could be asserted. He started to speak, stopped, then tried again. "Chloe." "Her name is Ava," Chloe said softly, turning from the skyline. "I saw the blueprints." Something in his composed expression fractured then, not with the explosive rage of a man caught in a lie, but with the silent, crumbling collapse of a designer who finally sees the fatal structural flaw in his own creation and understands it's too late to fix. "I never meant for you to find out," he whispered. "I know," Chloe said. "That was never the issue." She met his gaze, her eyes clear of the storm of tears that had passed hours ago. They had weathered the worst of the emotional hurricane and now rested in a place of cold, stark clarity she hadn't known in years. "The issue," she said, "was that it shouldn't have been a secret to begin with. Who I am, the mother of your child, should not have been the reason you built a separate life. You owed me some respect, Ethan." You owed me that because I am your wife, because I am carrying our child, because I am a human being going through the darkest hours of her life, and you were the one person I should have been able to count on. He had no defense for that. There was no defense. It was simply, crushingly, the absolute truth. You can see her, Maya said, her voice quiet. She deserves a father. But Ethan, she also deserves to see what a woman who knows her own value looks like, and so do I. Ethan looked at Sophie. He gazed at the tiny sleeping face, and for a single moment, the entire room felt something that was almost like peace. "Good night," Maya said. And Ethan Sterling walked back to the door, took the elevator down to the lobby, and stood in the descending quiet, believing he finally understood the full scope of what he had thrown away. He was mistaken. He didn't even know the half of it. At 2:14 in the morning, Chloe Thorne sat in the leather seat of a luxury car 6 blocks from the Sterling Tower, and she placed a call that would incinerate what little was left of the evening's delicate truce and turn it into something much bigger, much more vicious than anything that had transpired inside that penthouse. The call went to a man named Julian Croft, 41 years old, a public relations fixer who thrived in the murky world between crisis management and digital assassination. He was the kind of operator who knew that in today's war for attention, the first story to go public becomes the gospel, whether it's true or not. "Julian," Chloe said, "I have a job for you, and the payout is going to be far more than your usual rate." By 3:30 that morning, the narrative was crafted. By 4:15, it was seeded across 3 separate online platforms. By 5, it was a trending topic. The headline screamed, "Art world heiress in jealous rage terrorizes husband's colleague in late-night confrontation." The angle was masterful in its cruelty. Maya was painted not as the wronged party, not as a 9 months pregnant woman discovering her husband's infidelity, but as a vindictive, unstable socialite who staged the entire scene to ruin her husband's professional associate. Chloe was cast as the innocent victim, a talented designer suffering from a migraine who was verbally assaulted and thrown out onto the street by a possessive wife who owned the building. The article cited anonymous sources close to the family. It presented Chloe's migraine as a serious medical issue that was cruelly ignored. It framed the arrival of Maya's security chief, Arthur Vance, as a move to physically intimidate a guest. It said nothing about the affair, nothing about the pregnancy, nothing about the betrayal. By 6 in the morning, Maya's name, her photo lifted from old university websites, her grandfather's charitable foundation, the gallery she ran, it was all public knowledge. The privacy Maya had guarded for her entire life, the anonymity her grandfather had always called his most precious gift to her, was vaporized by a single headline. Arthur woke Maya at 6:20 with the news. She was in the guest suite on the 40th floor, Sophie asleep in a bassinet beside her, the Boston skyline starting to glow through the panoramic windows. She stared at the tablet Arthur held in front of her. She read the headline. She read the first 3 paragraphs, and for the first time that night, a new kind of pain etched itself onto her face. Not the pain of childbirth, not the sting of betrayal, but the agony of exposure. The unique violation of having your life story hijacked by someone with no right to it, retold incorrectly, and twisted to paint you as the monster in your own tragedy. In the digital age, friends, your entire identity can be stolen and rewritten in a matter of minutes. The only thing that can save you is the truth, recorded, time-stamped, and ready to deploy. If you are ever in a position where the story could be turned against you, start documenting everything. Not later, now. Maya put the tablet down. She looked at Sophie. She looked out at the city. Then her eyes met Arthur's. "What is our response?" she asked. Arthur opened his portfolio. "Everything," he replied. The security logs from the building's lobby, showing every one of Ethan's late-night arrivals and departures for the last 6 months, time-stamped and verified. The credit card receipts showing Chloe's expensive bracelet was purchased by Ethan last week. The phone records, the private car service logs, the hotel bookings from his business trips that he told Maya were solo, and, he added, laying one last folder on the table, the encrypted text logs between Ethan's mother, Isabel Sterling, and Chloe, showing she arrived at the building 45 minutes before Ethan did and was waiting in the lobby when he got home. She was part of it. Maya stared at that final piece of evidence for a very long time. She was part of it, Maya repeated. Arthur nodded. She knew he was bringing you the bracelet tonight. She knew the affair was happening. She helped them coordinate. The betrayal wasn't just impulsive, it was a performance. Maya shut her eyes for 3 seconds. When she opened them, they were completely clear, absolutely steady. "What else?" she asked. Arthur hesitated. "There's more," he said, "but perhaps you should get some rest first." "I don't want to rest," Maya said. "I want to know it all." What Arthur revealed to Maya over the next 40 minutes on the 40th floor of the Sterling Tower, while Sophie slept and the city awakened, and the false story spread like a plague through the digital world, was not one single truth. It was an excavation, layer by layer, of a meticulously planned deception. Each layer went deeper than the one before it, each one uncovering a hidden architecture of betrayal that Maya had felt for years but could never quite prove existed. Arthur started with Isabel. When the Foundation's digital security flagged the initial anonymous online posts, Arthur had triggered a deep dive protocol into all communications involving the Sterling family for the past 18 months. It was a failsafe he and Maya's grandfather had designed years ago, a silent alarm in case the family ever tried to use legal means to break the trust. What the system found was not a recent development, it was a long-running conspiracy. Isabel Sterling had been communicating with a man named Marcus Thorne for over a year. Marcus Thorne was 68 years old, the former titan of Thorne Development, and 15 years ago he had attempted a hostile takeover of the Ashworth Group, Maya's grandfather's company. It was a bid that Richard Ashworth had crushed so completely, so publicly, that Marcus Thorne had spent the next decade and a half simmering in a resentment that had hardened into a cold, calculated, and extremely dangerous obsession. Isabel's messages with Marcus, retrieved from encrypted servers by the Foundation's security team, showed a plan that was far more than a coincidence. Marcus had been giving Isabel strategic counsel on how to position Ethan for a contentious divorce, one that would give him the strongest possible claim to Maya's assets. Isabel had been supplying Marcus with intimate details about Maya's life, her moods, her health, her private worries, compiling a file that could be used to argue she was unstable, just as the online stories were now claiming. The affair with Chloe wasn't a mistake, Arthur said. It was an insertion. Maya stared at him. "Insertion?" she repeated. Arthur slid a document across the table. "Chloe Reeves," he said, "born Chloe Thorne, Marcus Thorne's daughter." The room was perfectly silent. Chloe was introduced into Ethan's professional network. 14 months ago at a charity auction sponsored by a shell company owned by Marcus Thorne. The meeting was arranged. The relationship was manufactured with one clear goal: to blow up your marriage from the inside, to create a public scandal that would give the Sterling family leverage, and to make Ethan look like the victim when the true size of your inheritance was finally revealed. Maya sat perfectly still. She glanced at the framed photo of her grandfather on the desk, at the face of the man who had built an empire, and who had defeated Marcus Thorne 15 years earlier. The man who had once told her that the money was the least important part of his legacy. Ethan wasn't the enemy, Maya said, her voice barely a whisper. He was the weapon. Arthur nodded. He was the weapon. Always trust your gut, viewers. If the way someone acts toward you feels planned, if every little jab, every backhanded compliment, every supposed accident seems to push toward the same outcome, you're not being paranoid. You're recognizing a pattern, and all patterns have a creator. But the conspiracy was not done unfolding. Because Marcus Thorne, empowered by the very smear campaign he had funded, now had the public distraction he needed to make his real move. He acted faster than anyone could have predicted. At 8:30 that morning, less than 6 hours after Chloe's call to Julian Croft, Marcus Thorne's lawyers filed a formal motion to invalidate the Ashworth Foundation Trust. The legal reasoning was complex, vicious, and engineered for chaos. The trust, they alleged, was fundamentally flawed. Richard Ashworth, they claimed, had not been mentally competent when he named Maya his sole heir. The entire inheritance, their motion declared, was therefore legally questionable. And as part of that motion, Thorne's lawyers submitted a petition to support a reevaluation of custody for Sophie, this time with a far more sophisticated argument. The logic was simple and brutal. If the trust was invalid, Maya's vast inheritance became community property, and the intentional concealment of community property, coupled with her supposed emotional instability, was grounds for a full custody hearing. Maya was facing the loss of everything: her grandfather's legacy, her child, and her freedom. All because she had loved a man who was never worthy of it. And because Liam's family had unknowingly partnered with her company's fiercest rival, this was the moment Clara hit rock bottom. She sat in the penthouse office, Stella sleeping in her bassinet, the lights of Seattle a glittering carpet below. For the first time all night, her composure shattered. She was terrified. She picked up a photograph of her late mentor and stared at it, remembering what Anya had told her just hours before. You build systems so flawless that other people's sloppiness becomes their own undoing. He ever made. Clara set the picture down. She looked at Anya. I need Ben, she said, and I need every line of code from Project Chimera for the last 2 years. For the first time all evening, Anya allowed herself a small, sharp smile. Already compiling, she said. Clara Hayes didn't do revenge. She did system architecture, and what she built over the next 72 hours from a home office with a newborn daughter beside her and a tech team that answered only to her was not a countermove. It was an audit of reality. Every data packet logged, every connection verified, every angle calculated. Each move was designed not to ruin her enemies, but to make the truth so visible, so comprehensive, and so irrefutable that their downfall was simply the logical outcome of the system executing. Phase 1, the data dump. Clara released a single encrypted file to a select list of tech journalists and board members. No spin, no narrative, just raw data. The decrypted audio files from her own home network. Time-stamped and unedited, with all voices clear except for the ambient city noise. The network logs showing a private server connection registered to Izzy Moreau 2 days in advance. The credit card receipts, the server pings showing Liam's location when he told Clara he was in a meeting. The smart home logs showing Izzy's calculated entry into the building before Clara left for her appointment. She let the data speak, and it screamed so loudly that every tech blog that had praised Liam's latest venture spent the next 24 hours desperately trying to reframe their narrative. Derek Vance, the blogger who had published the most glowing profile, received a formal data correction request from Clara's legal team. It wasn't a threat, just a correction with documentation so thorough that his publisher pulled the article within 6 hours. Phase 2, the hostile takeover defense. Anya filed a preemptive injunction against Marcus Thorne's company, and the digital document she submitted contained a single piece of evidence that ended his corporate raid before it even began. 2 years ago, when Marcus Thorne had attempted to acquire Clara's company, his own cybersecurity consultants had conducted a full audit of her system architecture as part of their due diligence. That very audit, filed as part of the acquisition attempt, had concluded in writing that Project Chimera's code was fundamentally unbreachable, legally sound, and that Clara Hayes was the sole architect and owner of the intellectual property. Marcus Thorne's current claim that the code was improperly sourced directly contradicted his own firm's prior expert opinion. His team had already validated the very asset he was now trying to steal. The intellectual property court did not need long to decide. The claim was dismissed with prejudice. Marcus Thorne's company was referred to the industry's ethics committee for review. Phase 3, the divorce. Clara filed on the morning of the third day. The filing was digital, precise, and devastating. It included Liam's encrypted chats with Marcus Thorne, proving he had conspired with his wife's greatest professional rival to undermine her life's work. It included the evidence of the affair with Izzy. It included the network logs, and it included one more piece of metadata that Anya had saved for this very moment. Izzy Moreau was not just Liam's mistress, she was Marcus Thorne's daughter. The entire relationship had been a corporate espionage operation. Izzy had been put in Liam's path by Marcus as part of a coordinated campaign to infiltrate Clara's life through her marriage. When this information went public, the reaction was seismic, not because of the money, not because of the affair, but because the story had become something bigger than a marriage ending. It had become a story about a brilliant woman, underestimated by everyone around her, who endured that condescension with quiet focus for years, and who, when the moment came, revealed that the person they had dismissed was the most powerful one in the room. Ben, who had been running diagnostics and managing servers for 72 hours straight, and looked like a man who had aged 5 years and 3 days, slumped into a chair in Anya's office after the last file was uploaded and said, "I need to power down." Anya, reviewing the final injunction, said without looking up, "You're in sleep mode, Ben." He stared at the ceiling. "I need a full system shutdown." The fallout came with the swift, inevitable logic of gravity. Izzy Moreau was exposed. Her connection to Marcus Thorne became the centerpiece of the very tech news cycle that had previously featured her as a rising star in the art world. Her career, which had been built on connections, appearances, and the currency of being in the right circles, collapsed in less than a week. Marcus Thorne had investors who could stomach aggressive tactics. They could not tolerate the public revelation that he had used his own daughter as a pawn in a corporate vendetta. His board requested his resignation within 10 days. His 15-year grudge had cost him his company. The venture capital firm that had backed Liam, largely at his mother's insistence, quietly dissolved their partnership. They knew a toxic asset when they saw one, and Liam's mother, Catherine Vance, who had spent 4 years engineering Clara's isolation from the family, who had scoffed at her daughter-in-law's work ethic, who had positioned herself as the architect of a social campaign so subtle and cruel that even her own children were appalled when the full scope became clear, was cut off from the Vance Family Foundation by Liam's own siblings. They issued a joint statement through their lawyer that was only 3 sentences long, but said everything. Catherine Vance was not invited to meet her granddaughter. She would not be invited. And the family photos on the digital displays, the ones she had spent years curating with Clara, always slightly out of focus, were wiped from the server entirely. 6 months later, Clara Hayes stood in a workspace, not the cold corridor of a data center, not a shared office with flimsy dividers and bad fluorescent lighting. This space was new. It was warm, the lighting was user-defined, the floors were polished concrete, and the chairs that filled the collaboration pods were ergonomic, supportive, and positioned with care. Because the woman who had designed this space understood in the most personal way possible what it felt like to sit in a chair that wasn't designed for you while doing the most important work of your life. The Stella Hayes Incubator for Women in Tech occupied the entire renovated top floor of a building in South Lake Union. Clara had funded it from the patents she had finalized on the night of Stella's birth. It was not the largest incubator the tech world had ever seen, but it was the most personal. The center provided seed funding and resources to women whose ideas were so often dismissed, women who would otherwise code alone in their apartments, women whose partners didn't understand, women who deserved, at the most vulnerable and powerful moment of their creative lives, to be in the right place, to have someone say to them, "Everything from here is supported." Clara stood in that space with Stella in her arms, 6 months old now, with her mother's intense eyes and her namesake's promise and the complete, uncomplicated certainty of a child who did not yet know the story of how she came to be, but who would one day understand that the building she was in was built because of it. Anya stood beside Clara as she had for a decade, with the quiet, steady presence of a mentor who understood her role was not to lead, but to support. To be the person who responds to a 3 a.m. text with, "I'm on it." Ben was there too, trying to take a picture of the incubator's logo on the wall and somehow managing to get his own reflection in every shot. He had been promoted twice in 6 months. Anya said it was because of his work during the crisis. Ben said it was because no one else was willing to run physical server backups at 2 in the morning. Both of these things were true. Dr. Evelyn Reed, Clara's former professor, had come for the opening. She stood near the entrance, talking with 2 young founders about their scalable architecture, and when she saw Clara, she crossed the room and placed her hand briefly on her arm, on Chloe's shoulder, the same protective gesture, the same steadying presence. Some things, thankfully, were built to last. Her sister, Maya, a partner at a downtown law firm, had arrived within the hour of Chloe's call. She had made the arrangements, fielding Julian's panicked calls with a specific kind of legal calm that left no room for argument. She had advised Chloe on every step, ensuring her sister was protected, not just emotionally, but financially. She got the apartment. Chloe hadn't laid eyes on Julian in 4 months. The divorce was settled with surgical precision, defying the messy, prolonged battle their social circle had anticipated. Julian hadn't fought a single point. He signed every paper, agreed to every condition, and when the final decree was issued, he had his assistant deliver a single hand-drawn sketch to Chloe's new address. It depicted a broken column. Below it, he had written, "I'm sorry, not for the affair, but for the flawed blueprint." Chloe studied it. She didn't reply, not because the sentiment was empty, but because it was 5 years and 8 months overdue, and the woman who might have cared about his architectural metaphors was gone forever. Julian had visitation rights for their son Leo. He exercised them, showing up every other Saturday with a quiet determination to be the kind of father he failed to be as a husband. Chloe never stood in the way. She believed Leo deserved to know the man who designed half of him. She also believed Leo deserved to see what it looked like when a woman built a world entirely on her own terms, and she planned to spend every day of his life giving him a masterclass. Here is the final lesson worth sharing, dear friends, and it is the one that matters most. The greatest victory isn't about demolition, it's about creation. It's building a life so rich with flavor and joy that the person who thought your world was small has to watch you host a feast from across the street. That is the success they can never comprehend, not because it's meant to punish them, but because it is designed to nourish you. And that nourishment, the kind that comes from honoring your own recipe for happiness and refusing to let anyone else tell you the ingredients are wrong, is the one thing no one can ever take from your table. Chloe looked around the bustling kitchen, at the chefs already plating their first orders, at the tables that were warm and rustic and positioned so that every guest felt like the center of the room. She looked at the glowing sign over the door, Leo's Table, the culmination of a dream she had almost given up. She held her son a little tighter, inhaled the scent of garlic and rosemary, and walked through the doors of the restaurant she built, into the life she had created, into the future she had once sketched out on a stained napkin in a college dorm room. She never looked over her shoulder, not for a second, because nothing she left behind was more satisfying than what she was building. Friends, you just witnessed the story of a woman who was underestimated, sidelined, and betrayed at her most hopeful moment, who responded not with bitterness, but with creativity, passion, and the quiet, undeniable force of a person who finally decided to cook for herself. The lesson is simple but profound. Never mistake someone's support for a lack of ambition, never confuse their patience for a lack of vision, and never, ever treat someone's love as the foundation for your own secret projects. Because you don't know who they truly are, you don't know the dreams they are simmering beneath the surface, and by the time you smell what they're cooking, it might be the most successful restaurant in the city, and you won't be able to get a reservation. Drop a comment with the biggest insight you gained from Chloe's journey. What would you have built in her situation? And subscribe for more incredible and empowering stories like this one. Until we meet again, know your own recipe, trust your own taste, and never let anyone make you feel like a side dish in your own life. This story was meticulously researched, written, and produced by our team to provide compelling narratives with powerful life lessons. Every character arc was designed with purpose, and every plot point holds a message worth considering. Thank you for being a valued member of our audience.